Hardware to Save a Planet explores the technical innovations that are giving us hope in the fight against climate change. Each episode focuses on a specific climate challenge and explores an emerging physical technology solution with the person bringing it into reality. I'm your host, Dylan Garrett. Hello and welcome to Hardware to Save a Planet. I'm here with Marcelino Alvarez, the CEO and founder of Photon Marine. We're going to talk about electrifying commercial boat fleets. We've had a number of episodes focused on electrifying or otherwise decarbonizing cars and trucks, which is super important. But I think once you take that conversation to the water, things get really interesting. That's partly because electronics and salt water don't mix well, but also all the different opportunities to have a positive impact in ways other than just reducing emissions. Conventional gas-powered boats create noise and other pollution in marine ecosystems, and the health of those ecosystems is, of course, such a key part of having a healthy planet. Also, businesses that rely on boats face unique challenges that electrification can address. So I think what Marcelino is doing is a great example of creating something that's good for the environment, but is also just a better product all around. Marcelino is a lifelong boater. He grew up fishing and scuba diving in South Florida. He started his career in advertising and then founded and ran a product design firm that helped develop new hardware and software products for big brands like Samsung, Nike, and Google. I'm really excited to hear more about what he's building at Photon Marine. So Marcelino, welcome and thanks for joining.
Dylan, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here on the show today.
So you and I have something in common, which is that we both spent a lot of time in this kind of product development consulting world. We could go super deep on that, I'm sure, but I'm kind of curious to hear, you've made the jump to start your own company now. Like, I'm curious to hear about that journey. Like, what motivated you to do that?
Sure. I think I've always had the itch to start a company and build products. And I think admittedly, as a person who considers himself a generalist, I've never either had the courage or the experience or the right mix of opportunity to pursue that has said, hey, you should totally quit your day job and jump into this. Just personally, I grew up fishing and snorkeling and scuba diving in the Florida Keys. So like being on the water, below the water is something that I've always been incredibly comfortable with and very passionate about. Growing up in Florida, in the 80s and 90s, the idea of conservation was a pretty just kind of open concept of how do we preserve the waters that we're enjoying today to, enable us to enjoy them tomorrow. So it wasn't really a political concept, but it was something that's very much ingrained like in me by my family, like growing up as a kid. But yeah, professionally, I've always been on the professional services side. I started out in advertising, working for a number of ad agencies. That's what brought me out west to Portland, Oregon. I, while working for those ad agencies, saw the rise of mobile application design and development. I was like, maybe there's something there. And we had ideas, but I didn't have the courage, I think, just to quit my day job and just build out those ideas. And so we're like, well, let's help other people build their apps. And so we started a company kind of focused on that. That was Uncork Studios. And we ran that for about 10 years and, sold that to a larger consultancy. And each step I was kind of shifting closer towards just, focusing on a single thing. And so my post-acquisition life was as the chief product officer. It's like, this is great. I can focus on a thing. And then the pandemic hit about, 3 months after the acquisition and, the playbook kind of went out the door. And so it was sort of in that early, aftermath of pandemic, slog and really kind of searching for purpose where I started asking myself like, hey, what's next? And I remember reaching out to a friend of mine who's now one of our co-founders. His background is fisheries nonprofits, and we were just talking about the role that technology could play in his life. And he was talking about better IoT, maybe devices for ocean monitoring or cold storage for fisheries in Chile and Peru. And he's like, honestly, if we don't electrify the motors that these fishers are on, there's just no amount of conservation that can keep up. We need to fix that. And originally, it just thought like, well, let's just go buy some motors and we'll stick it on a Jamaican fishing boat. We'll have a cool project. Kind of brought a consultant mind to the prompt. And I think over time realized like no one's doing this. No one's building a sufficiently high powered motor. No one's really looking at these applications. Why don't we do this? Let's, how hard could it be? It's hard, but how hard could it be? Maybe the founders folly thinking that it's not that difficult. But yeah, that's how we got underway.
Why is nobody else doing this? I mean, everything's getting electrified, right? Why is there something really
Sure.
challenging
I mean,
about
that was Yeah, that was, I think, true then. I think others
Hmm.
have since then, or were in parallel looking at the same solution through different lens. But it's a great question because I think there is segmentation in both those that are jumping into this space and they fall into a few categories. And there's also segmentation in terms of the actual product that they're delivering. So there are electric boats that are out there. And I think, if you Google, you'll see anyone, in the US to Northern Europe, companies that are building, you know, the Teslas of electric boats. It's a
Hmm.
completely bespoke solution that is tailored to recreational boater in mind. And we certainly think that that is a very viable approach to electrification, but it's not going to move the needle in terms of decarbonizing marine or decarbonizing our industry because sadly the average recreational boater only uses their boats 50 or 100 hours a year. Maybe if you're in a place like Florida you can get up a little bit more beyond that, but for the most part, recreational boaters aren't making the dent on the environment. It's the commercial operators. And the commercial operators use their systems, 1,000 to 2,000 hours per year. They're on the water every single day, day in, day out. And they're spending a ton on fuel. They're spending a ton on oil changes and the routine maintenance for, the motor systems that they use, which are tailored to the recreational boater. And so the service cycle on an outboard motor is every 100 or 300 hours, which for a rec boater is every 1 or 3 years. But for those commercial customers, they're doing that service every 6 weeks or so.
Hmm.
That means get the boat out of the water, replace the spark plugs, the impellers, the oil change, gear loop change. Like that, it's a full service package. And so, in addition to paying a mechanic and scheduling that time, like you're just losing revenue from that being on the water. So that's sort of a little bit of the dynamics of the industry. And so those that are building electric yachts, electric pleasure craft, that's great for market consideration, but it's not going to move the needle. And then you do have some folks that have built electric outboards or electric inboards that are part of the solution. But I think because they've seen sort of the market be driven by recreational, they've optimized their solutions for those recreational boaters. And so a recreational boater is going to be a bit more charging dependent because they might be trailering their boat from one part of the state to the other to drop it in. They're not always going to the same location. They're not coming from that same location. And so when you do a market analysis of a recreational boater, your figure of metric should be, can I get a day out of the water out of a single charge? And that might not be possible at a higher horsepower class. And so you opt for something that's a little bit smaller that you could fit enough battery in a boat. On the commercial side, it's a little bit different. And I think it certainly varies by industry. And we'll say this, there are certainly some industries where it absolutely does not make sense to go electric. But for a lot of commercial customers, the duty cycle looks like depart from the dock, go to the floating fish net or the rock where the penguin's at, or the place where you're going to do your water quality sampling, and then you come back. You're moving people or products maybe across those distances, but it's generally the same route. And you're coming back to that dock, and that dock already has charging capacity because marinas have electrical infrastructure. And for an average commercial operator, being able to charge a system overnight on existing marina infrastructure is sufficient to contemplate a transition to electric. There's going to be some applications that will require DC fast charging, but by and large, there's a big enough market just looking at commercial for operations that are going out and back. And when you're doing that, and looking at sort of like how much energy they're using. Well, they're not running their motors for 8 hours a day. They might be operating for half an hour to an hour to get to that destination. They're cutting off the motor to do whatever the activity is, whether it's hydraulic dredge operation or scuba diving, snorkeling. Like you're not running the motor, and so the energy usage isn't a full 8 hours. It
Hmm.
might be 90 minutes. It might be 2 hours. And with that, you can certainly go at a higher horsepower class, which is what they need for the vessels that they're operating. And you can still hit that figure of merit of having enough power to basically, achieve what's the equivalent of a day on the water. A day on the water is not 8 hours of operation. It's going to vary by commercial customer, but with existing marina infrastructure, you can support that. So why is no one
Hmm.
doing this? I mean, I think there are folks that are doing it, but they're kind of slicing it different ways. Some people see the recreational slice of the market and say that's where we want to go in on, and that's great. Some people say we want to go in for high-end electric yachts or high-end wake boats because we want to own that sector, and they've done the calculation. Others are doing pontoon boats for lake boats in Michigan. Sure,
Hmm.
those are all viable sectors. I think for us, we factored in a few things: the differentiation at a horsepower profile, the economic validity of a system, including like total cost of ownership, and the environmental impact. And for us, the sweet spot of really achieving demonstrable gains in each of those just squarely like lit like a giant spotlight on like
Hmm.
commercial. Like this is it. There's no other way to have impact and have a reasonable payback period that doesn't start with commercial. So that's why we chose.
Tell me more about the environmental impact side of it, because it sounds like you started with this notion and this conversation with your friend about how do we help with ocean conservation, and why is it that electrifying motors is so important in that process? It's got to be more than just about the greenhouse gas emissions, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you're going to get to gigaton carbon reduction on just electric outboard motors alone. And I think that, and we talked about this previously, I think when you just look at impact through the lens of a single metric, you miss out on quite a bit. So our advice to folks that are kind of trying to have impact is like, don't just look at a single metric without looking at others. There are a number of other factors on the environmental side that electric systems will benefit. I'll start with environmental ones first. In many places around the world, the existing ICE, internal combustion engine outboard motor incumbent is not a brand new shiny, Mercury Yamaha 4-stroke. It's a 10, 20, or 30-year-old 2-stroke. And a lot of those old systems release up to 25% of their fuel completely unburnt straight into the water column. And can you measure that? No, because many of the countries that these things are operating in aren't measuring what these operators are doing day in and day out. But these are the commercial operators. They're operating in places like Belize or Bali, like beautiful places that are very ocean dependent, are still relying on 2-strokes because when a 2-stroke motor breaks, they can take it apart and fix it right there on the water. And for them, the convenience of simple maintenance regime outweighs the environmental, monstrosity that is releasing 25% of your fuel straight into the water column. That's an aspect that we would love to see rectified, particularly because the electric outboard motor system doesn't really require the same maintenance cycle, and also it's not releasing 25% of its fuel unburnt into the water column.
Yeah.
I think that if you think about even just your normal 4-strokes, studies were done in the US showing that like just the 1 or 2 drop, sort of drip at the marina adds up and, basically adds up to the equivalent of something like a dozen Exxon Valdez oil spills in the US, each year just from like that slick that you see at marinas. But you don't see it in the news because you don't see the mammals or the wildlife because it's not all in one, giant event. It's literally, death by 1,000 cuts or drops as it were. And that may have improved a little bit with like auto top off, sort of like shut off on marinas. It was an older study, but again, marinas are just filthy places because of all the oil and fuel that gets spilled there. Certainly oil changes are part of the mix. And when you're, blasting through the maintenance cycles every 6 weeks, you're going through quite a bit of oil. And so, yeah, there are other environmental impacts based on the emissions, the fumes, the smell that are part of it. But then there's also the noise aspect. And, we've had commercial operators out on our boat who didn't want to get on a boat because they didn't believe that an electric outboard motor was a thing, who get on and say, I'm hard of hearing because I've spent a lifetime on the water. And if this technology had existed, I might still have my hearing. And the same is true for humans as it is for the megafauna that live below the boats that they're operating, and the whales and dolphins and other mammals that are affected by the cavitation and the vibration and the noise of outboard motors. Now, we're still going to have cavitation, right? So you'll still have some engine noise, but understanding what that delta is part of it, and reducing that noise signature both above and below the water is important for quality of life for a worker who's spending day in and day out on the boat. It's also important for, government defense applications, right? Having a quieter noise signature is something that could be beneficial for a number of military and defense applications as well.
Maybe a stupid question, but what is actually the impact of all, you talk about just all this like unburnt oil and fuel going into the water? I mean, yeah, it sounds like a stupid question, but why is that such a bad thing? What is the actual like knock-on effect of that?
I'm not an environmental scientist, so I would point to the studies of it. But, I know that if you look at a lot of the coral reefs, sensitive coral reefs that like these operators are taking people to, like dumping fuel into those coral reefs hurts the fish that are living there, the corals that are living there. Certainly not helping, when you already have warming ocean temperatures combined with fuel being dumped into there is not, a sustainable option for the coral reef. So it's just, I think the old way of looking at things was like, well, dilution is the solution to pollution. Like that doesn't add up. The ocean is not an infinite resource. Like I think we've treated it as such. And I think in order to really, transition into where we need to go from like a behavioral change standpoint, like just not dumping oil and gas into the waters is part of it. But I would
Probably,
say
yeah.
it's not the only factor, right? Like noise above and below the water. I mean, the fumes, again, you can certainly measure the chemicals in the fumes, but if you're a human who has spent, time above the boat as it's idling, like you're sucking fumes. And if you're a whale that is, around a bunch of boats that are trying to sightsee and you're coming up for air and what you're sucking is the, the fumes that are in the back of the boat, that's also not good. In the US each year, there are a number of drownings from people who are just being towed behind a boat going, skiing or wakeboarding that suffocate, they pass out on carbon monoxide and they drown. These are all avoidable things, right? But we've sort of built in this acceptance of like, well, it's just the way that it is. Boats are smelly.
Hmm.
I'm used to boats being smelly, or boats are loud. I'm used to them being loud. It's like, but they don't have to be. And if they weren't, would you be in a better place to commune with nature, which is the reason why you are
Right.
boating in the first place? Like, or catch the fish that you want to eat, or you're
Right.
doing like underwater hydrography and you want like better underwater data, and now your boat's not vibrating, or you're trying to do ocean sampling and you're worried about the emissions from the motors that you use to get there, ruining the like the, efficacy of whatever initiative you're trying to do, whether it's for, leisure or professional reasons, can be improved substantially by transitioning to electric. So why do you make the excuse of like, yeah, I'm totally fine with this maintenance regime? Why? You shouldn't have to maintain your boat
Right.
every 100 hours. Like, would you accept that for your car? Like, could you imagine if like we drove like cars the way that we drove boats and like said, well, I'm due for an oil change. It's the third week of the month. Time for an oil change. It's like, we wouldn't drive our cars like that. Why do we assume that that maintenance regime is something acceptable for boats? It's just the way it is. And that's always the way that it's been. And that is prevailing knowledge in the industry for some reason.
Yeah. I did an episode with a group that's making these kind of lighted buoys to help reduce bycatch in fishing nets. So it helps you improve your chance of catching your target species and not catching turtles and whales and sharks and stuff. One of the things that surprised me was going into that conversation, I expected the fishing operations to kind of be the villain, like they're causing this problem. But one of the things that surprised me was how much these kind of small family run fishing businesses were actually really wanting better environmental solutions. They want to be good stewards of the environment. To your point, like their businesses depend on conservation of the ocean. I'm curious if you've seen that same dynamic. Like, are they actually part of the solution here in the same way?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that the fishing communities, aquaculture, wild caught fisheries, like they all want a solution that's going to make
Hmm.
it better for their businesses. And I think that's true whether if you're on the fishing side or even, there's a number of like mom and pop tourism
Right.
operators in the US and internationally, right? Like the benefits to them obviously are you're taking people out on the water to go see this whale or go to the scuba dive on this reef. So you want that to be a pleasurable experience. If you're giving safety instructions to a tourist who's not familiar with the boat, you want them to be able to hear those instructions, not have to yell over the rumbling of a diesel system or an old outboard. If you're an oyster farmer, you literally have the ocean sponges, the filters, like you don't want to be operating with oil, any amount of oil or fuel being released into the water column because that is the quality of your byproduct. Same thing with, kelp farmers. And so, yes, I think that there is demonstrable interest, from an environmental perspective from each of those communities. There's also an interest from just an economics perspective. Like the highest cost to many of these operators, or most of them, beyond, personnel is fuel, followed by the maintenance regime. And so if they want to be able to ultimately offer their, consumers a more cost-effective product, the only way to do that is to get rid of fuel. Fuel is that cost driver. Like you're not gonna be able to pay people less, right? If you can pay people less, not gonna work, but you can certainly cut your fuel costs and make that part of your transition. Now your unit economics change. And in the case of whale watching operators or tourism operators, you might be able to charge a premium on a fume-free experience while also drastically changing the unit economics of your operation. So in some markets, I think you could lower your cost basis and improve your margin substantially. And in others, just improve your margin substantially because
Hmm.
you're not paying the fuel and maintenance cycle. So I think it's primarily driven by economics and secondarily by environmental reasons. And I think the third one is, can it meet the duty cycle that I need it to? And I think, again, that's why having a higher horsepower electric propulsion system is needed because what had historically been out there was not sufficient to get that commercial operator to their site or to their destination. And so you need to be able to supply the torque and the propulsion needed to move that vessel to the water.
Right. And that's just a set of kind of user requirements that nobody else was addressing. Yeah.
Not at the time. There's one other company right now that's in a similar horsepower profile to where we're at. And, the way that we like to think about it is there's room for more than one, probably more than five,
Right.
companies looking at electric propulsion in the same way that when you buy a gas outboard motor, you've got Mercury, Yamaha, Honda, right? There's almost half a dozen gas outboard motor companies supplying tech. There's room for, an equal amount of electric propulsion providers. And even if every single gas outboard motor company stopped making outboard motors today and switched to 100% electric, it would still take them 30 years to repower every boat that's out there. And I think that's a distinction that's worth noting, is that unlike a car, boats are designed to have their power plant replaced every few years. And if you're a recreational boater, that might be once every 5 to 7 years. If you're my dad, that's once a decade because he takes care of everything with a toothbrush. But for most folks, it's a 5 to 7 year cycle. The commercial operators are replacing their outboard motors every other year, do it every year so they can sell it with a warranty. It's bonkers. And yes, you do find some that will hang on to it because they don't have the economic resources to replace it, but then they're blasting through the estimated life cycle of those motors. So again, we would never accept a car that could only be driven for 10,000 miles. And yet that's kind of the equivalent of what we're doing with our boats. And we're like, well, it's hit the
Right.
3,000 hour mark. Time to get rid of it. What?
Wow.
How does that fly? Well, here's the one with an extended range. It'll give you 5,000 hours of operation. It's like, what? That would never fly.
Yeah. What's the expected operation for yours?
We're targeting 10,000 hours, which again could be a solid 10-year commercial operation. And, we'll test it when we get there, but we certainly think that, at the end of that 10-year mark, you're maybe replacing the battery and just continuing to go with, the electric motor because there's just fewer moving parts to have, wear and tear. So it's a theoretical limit that I think we can easily blast through on the propulsion side. And then TBD on the batteries. I think a lot of the early research out of Tesla has shown that their estimates on, battery degradation were way more conservative or, more aggressive than what's actually being seen. And so, at the end of 3,000 or so cycles, the battery doesn't die. It just has a lower, top end state of charge. And that depends on, how are you charging it and how are you taking care of it? So results will vary, but if you take care of it, it should certainly exceed those windows.
Wow. Okay. So you're selling motors and I assume batteries to commercial operators who own a boat already and are already used to this cycle of swapping out their motors. So they're buying an electric motor and battery system rather than gas powered motor. And they're buying that motor from you.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. And we're going to start with new vessel builds. So commercial boats that have been outfitted out of the gate with the full stack, just because it simplifies things on our end and just makes, sort of the variability a little bit different. We can plan for, here's a whole type that's an aluminum workboat. Here's a rigid inflatable catamaran. Here's something that's perhaps used for, more government municipal type reasons. So we'll have a suite of boat builders that we work with that could basically outfit an electric fleet for a customer. And some bigger ports might want 2 or 3 different boats from 2 or 3 different boat builders outfitted with our tech. Some tourism customers may want 2 or 3 different boats outfitted with our tech. And some might just say, hey, I just want this aluminum workboat, or I just want this, passenger vessel to go sightseeing. And so they'll kind of focus on a single solution. But to get to scale, we need to retrofit, right? There's 30 million, mechanically propelled vessels out there in the world. About, half of those are being used for some version of commercial operation. So how do we get to those? Working with retrofit partners, repower outfits, so that those exist for commercial operations where, when your Yamahas die, they'll come out, take out your old Yamahas and repower it. So working with partners like that, training them on high voltage systems and the integration of the battery is how we would approach it. Not all holes are going to be a great solution for retrofit, and it really depends. So we want to spend some time really surveying what that looks like and identifying a few target areas. I think the good news is on the commercial side, those mechanisms, those systems already exist. And on the commercial side, some of those holes have been optimized for replace the fuel tank at the 7 to 10 year mark, or repower at the 10-year mark with this, or repower at this 5-year mark with that. So we have both the systems and just the processes in place so that what a customer is doing is what they were already planning on doing, which is
Mhm.
repowering at a certain window, just rather than gas, it's not electric system.
I want to hear more about I guess, the whole kind of tech stack. So you have the motor, the battery. I think you have a software product as well. I saw on your website. Can you share what that's about?
Yeah. So obviously there's on vessel software. So
Mhm.
the instrument gauge, it kind of shows you how fast you're operating, how much range you have left at a particular speed. I think we would argue that table stakes for any sort of electric propulsion system is understanding and understanding what I'm doing and how much I have left. But beyond that, in chatting with commercial customers, and again, those are sort of our focal point. Like once we have a connected vessel, like what else could we offer you that you currently aren't getting from your ICE motor system? Like, would it be helpful to know where your boats are at? And they're like, yeah, right now, so, we've talked to customers who use like a walkie-talkie to like radio for someone, be like, hey, where's the boat? And then now the operator's got to like answer while operating a vessel to be like, here's where I'm at, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice to like look on a map and see where all your vessels are, understand when they're going to arrive? If you're charging multiple vessels at once, making sure that you can see that all your vessels are charging overnight so that you don't have any surprises because someone, was working on a construction site and disconnected a breaker somewhere to go work on something else that, unplugged all your boats. So access to just, convenience of sort of, operational data, where are my things is sort of entry level. I think over time, because our customers are using their systems quite a bit, we'll be able to really optimize like how much energy do you actually need to achieve the task that you're trying to do. You might not need to be running at 4,000 RPM. You could maybe run at 3,200 RPM and still achieve reasonable time to arrive at your destination and have plenty of energy left. And so those are some of the convenience features that we're hoping to kind of offer to our customers. So same as like your eco sport comfort mode in your car, optimizing the energy delivery and optimization for a variety of use cases. And I think you could do some, similar things with sort of the power profile. Like, are you optimizing for acceleration, or if you're doing an operation like a hydraulic dredge operation, you might not want very rapid acceleration while you're basically, doing precision level control. So being able to offer commercial customer operator like precision control at the throttle versus someone who might just be, accelerating quickly to get out to the whales before they,
Hmm.
move on to their next destination.
And what has that hardware development process been like? Are you working with motor manufacturers? Where are you innovating? What does that look like?
Yeah. So it's a number of areas, right? So historically, we started with off the shelf parts. We wanted to demonstrate an electric outboard motor as quickly as possible. So we took an existing gas outboard, we ripped out the gas power head, we stuck an electric motor in. We're like connect it, sort of like the old IoT, like we get the lights blinking and send the signal back. The hello world for motor propulsion is like, can we move the boat? And we did that. We did it with some available parts that we had accessible to us. And we're like, great. I guess we just built an 80 horsepower outboard. Wasn't that great, but it taught us a lot of things. And we're like, what's next? And so our CTO had in a previous lifetime worked for an electric motor supplier building a higher horsepower motor. He's like, hey, I didn't tell you all about this, but the thing I was working on before I joined you all full time was this. Would you be interested in trying this out? We're like, yes, this would be great. So that became sort of the basis for the second prototype, which again allowed us to demonstrate we can now push a bigger boat through the water with a little bit more control and a little bit more precision. And we involved, the on vessel software as well as the hardware. We're like, great, this is certainly a viable option, but it's not a scalable option because we're not going to be buying gas outboards and ripping out the power heads. Also, that's not really great for the environment to continue to subsidize the ice industry. So let's really now do a bottoms up design and understand like where there are areas to optimize from the lower unit to the overall weight of the system to optimizing cooling and all those things. So that's sort of the effort that we're on right now. We'll be testing our CV of that system in February, and then goal is to have 10 of those in customers' hands this year, later this summer, and then into the fall. And then we'll have a few on our end to kind of test across a variety of hull types and kind of put it through their passes and see where it goes from there. So yeah, so it's been iterative, right? We chose an area of novelty and exploration each time, qualified a thing, and said, great, now how do we make this more resilient to where the business needs to go? And so this next tranche has a lot more bespoke parts that we've designed from the propulsion side to the cooling side that are representative of what we think is valuable production intent. We're sourcing the batteries because we think that's a race to the bottom and didn't want to become a battery manufacturer. So that's something that we're working with the supplier. And then there's still some components in marine where you'll always be, working with suppliers. And I think, again, it's just one of those things that is it's one of those areas. Well, maybe be I'll defend it's the way it's always been done aspect of it. I won't always
Hmm.
defend that, but there's really no reason to reinvent the wheel in certain areas of the marine business. And I offer this as advice to others, maybe looking at this space is like, don't choose where you want to spend your limited resources for novelty and don't reinvent the wheel in places that you don't have to. And I know that there are some schools of thought on this where, it's the vertical integration. We have to own everything, which is how you wind up with an electric boat where, down to the steering wheel and the texture of the steering wheel has been designed by that company. That's a way to do it. But, for us, we had to really figure out where we were going to align with the behaviors of our commercial customers and where we were going to deviate from them. And a commercial customer might have wear and tear on a part that they want to go to their local supplier and be like, I just broke this thing, I need to buy it. And if we're suddenly the bottleneck for that, we're going to have some angry customers. And if it's a part that's not really critical to the novelty of our system, like, I don't need to own that part of it. Go to your local West Marine or your Harbor Freight and go buy the part. Like, I'm not going to
Hmm.
get away with that. And this is a philosophical thing. It's like there's like looks like feels like prototypes to validate is there. And
Hmm.
I think that a lot of that, sort of rapid innovation from those consulting days, like, is how we've approached this from here. Like, we had our first prototype in the water about 4.5 months,
Hmm.
not because we tried to design everything from scratch, but because we just wanted to demonstrate, like, can this work? And we validated some things and invalidated some things very quickly through that. And so, balancing speed to market with novelty of creation, like, hey, IP matters, and ownership of supply chains and optimization, and figuring out like where you're going to make, like, those are all definite reasons for like why at a certain point you bring in the design of a component or a product in house. But early on, you're trying to qualify so many things. Like, how do you know where you're choosing is the right place to choose? And so for us, it's like let's find that balance between off the shelf and bespoke. And sometimes we'll get it right, sometimes we'll get it wrong, but we're certainly limiting the risk by approaching it this way. So would offer that as advice to others in the hard tech space. It's
Yeah.
use prototypes to accelerate your speed to market and choose what you want to test for each of those along the way.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. Maybe even just to go even a layer deeper on it, can you say what you have done? You have some bespoke parts, it sounds like, and there's some
Yep.
custom stuff there. How do you know when to do that? What are the indicators that are telling you, like, okay, this is something we've got to do ourselves?
Indicator something to do ourselves. Is it a place that we are going to pick up efficiency in a way that an off the shelf component is not going to deliver us efficiency, right? So, like, range, is it going to give us more range? Yes,
Hmm.
let's pursue it because range is everything. Is it a place where we're going to pick up margin because you need to, have an operating business? Is it an area where the R&D effort versus like the tooling cost versus the margins like penciled out? And so I'll give you a use case of where it doesn't make sense out of the gate for us is, the actual mounting bracket, where the motor attaches to the boat. Like, we're like, yeah, eventually we'll get there, right? We know we can pick up maybe a couple $1,000s of margin at some point in time to do that. But there's other aspects of the motor that might change between now and then. So working with a standard connection point to the thing that attaches to the vessel, like, probably fine for now, probably fine for a while, to be honest, because the tooling cost for like that cast part is so expensive. It's like, I'd rather just source it at the expense of margin versus taking on the R&D effort to build something that is bespoke to a part whose other end might also change over time. And so the, expense of building out this system just doesn't pencil out for us right now. Let's work with a supplier that provides these things to OEMs already, right? Like, there are, tier one OEMs are working with similar suppliers for some of these parts. So why would we try to step in to that? Say nothing of will the engineering on the first pass deliver what it needs to out of the gate? Are we going to have as much institutional knowledge to build a better system to attach to the back of the boat? Like, it doesn't seem like an effort to place, our R&D versus like, could I take that time to optimize our cooling system? And could I take that same amount of time to,
Hmm.
figure out maybe a novel way to, set up our gearings? There's just areas where the novelty to efficiency of the overall system factor is so much higher than does it make sense just because we want ownership. So desire of ownership versus do you need to own it, I think is the qualifying question.
Yeah, and you have so many different constraints you're trying to work within, time and budget and your team's bandwidth and then all these customer requirements. Yeah, it's probably yeah, that's a great example. So you're designing the next iteration that you'll build 10 of for kind of pilot customers. What do you see as the biggest challenges you'll face moving past that point?
I think the biggest challenges beyond that point are really tied to the integration with the boats. And so, we've got some really solid boat building partners that we've worked with to date, and we're ramping up additional boat building partners to that to support sort of our intentions to scale. But there's a little bit of novelty to, how you install an electric outboard motor system relative to a gas one. And so when the boat builder would normally install a fuel tank, certainly is part of it, right? So the actual manufacturing process for how they assemble their hulls, where they're assembling their hulls, where those things are being shipped to are part of it. For us, because we're focused on commercial operations, it at least limits our scope. We can't sell any non-US boat to any US commercial customer. So, it at
Mm,
least simplifies the region that we're traveling to just because of the Jones Act and then some really old legacy laws that ought to be rewritten for a number of reasons. So there's just some integration time and really figuring out how do we set that up for success at scale. Because, I will say that a thing that the full-on system integrators or system designers do have working in their favor is that they control sort of the final experience that's delivered to their customer. And we don't, because we're working with a boat building customer and a commercial boat building customer. And so making sure that the overall user experience is aligned so that the moment you step onto that vessel, whether it was built by someone in Tacoma or someone in Halifax or someone in South Florida, that it is a consistent experience across that represents our brand and certainly the craftsmanship of these boat builders. And I think it's one of the things that I've appreciated in working with the boat building partners that we've onboarded so far and the ones we've talked to is like this is in many cases like second, third generation family businesses that have been around. So there's a lot of pride in that work and craftsmanship, but then scaling that, right? Finding boat builders that are of that ilk and aren't just trying to get to scale for scale's sake, but want to scale up that quality delivery to their customers. Like that's an important consideration. And honestly, that whole aspect from like building those relationships to doing the system integration to then customer delivery, like that's relationship building, and that takes time. Like you're not going
mm,
to convince either the boat builder or that boat builder's customer on just a pitch deck kind of and a fancy rendering. Like you need to kind of create space to get folks on the water and hear it and see it to believe it. And so yeah, there's a part of the marine buying behavior process that is very just person to person handshake driven, and just making space for that is a consideration. And I think that the neat thing about this is that people's boating experiences, however distinct their waters might be that they grew up on or operate in, there is a continuous thread that runs through it. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about marine is that however disparate your geography might be, your stories probably overlap with someone else's in some really interesting and meaningful ways.
I love that. Thinking about the future a bit even further out, what's your vision? What's your kind of long-term vision for Photon Marine? And, especially in the context of that like origin story of being about ocean conservation, like what kind of impact do you think a company like yours can have?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's about building, like scaling that idea of relationships, right? Like, how do
Hmm.
we become the trusted and just reliable partner for commercial operators around the world to transition their solutions to electric? And part of that starts with the pragmatism of electric's not going to work for everybody. And so, where are there solutions or other technologies like hybrid that could be part of that story, or other energy sources that could be part of that story? And part of that's making sure that we play nice with others, in the same way that someone might buy a lower horsepower Honda if they're outfitting their larger boat with the Mercury. Like we partner with others in this space that might be able to offer an electric solution today that's not yet, sort of contemplated on our roadmap. So I think for us, like we want to be part of the ecosystem, but not just taking from it, but really contributing and shaping and designing it. And that to us is a sort of a bit of a pay it forward approach. But like I said a couple of times in this talk, like there are enough boats out there that if all of us spent all our efforts electrifying, it would still take us quite a bit of time to get there. So I don't think it makes sense to scorch the earth or scorch the water. To sacrifice a single sail or single win. I think we need to figure out how we work together. And on the electric side, like we see sort of what, maybe the startup world you'd say are your competitors, like we see them as collaborators in a lot of areas because once you've unlocked, charging infrastructure in a place, well, hey, guess what? Someone who is selling recreational wake boats can use the same chargers that we're using for commercial boats. So like we're not really competing with the electric wake boats, and we're not really competing right now with the, lower power electric outboard motor companies. We all kind of need to work together to inform, to educate, advocate for the transition to electric. And so I think we can help our partners cover a bit of ground. And that's sort of philosophically how we look at it, because at the end of the day, the ocean benefits. At the end of the day, everyone whose livelihoods rely on the ocean and the creatures living within it and the humans transporting above it, they all need to be, able to benefit from this. And if someone trying to, win it, in a zero-sum game sort of mentality, then the the actual benefactors will lose out. So I think you need to be able to play nice, I would say, as part of that. And to be able to offer that as a compelling vision. I think you get caught up in, sort of narratives around like, startup, destroy all the earth. It's like, look, at the end of the day, a sale is a sale, sure. And you need a number of those to succeed as a business. We're not running a nonprofit, but you need to be mindful of the fact that the ocean's the ultimate benefactor from this, and you can't run your business otherwise.
I have three questions to close us out. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of the planet, and why?
There are a lot of days where I wake up with a lot of pessimism about the future of the planet. And I think, and it's in stark contrast to like my optimism about the ocean community, the climate tech community, but there is so much global conflict happening in the world. There are so many things that like we don't have attention spans for, that like I'll admit there are some days where it is hard not to look at the work that we're doing and asking ourselves, like, is this going to matter at the end of the day? Like, what is really going to lead to it? And I think that's geopolitical. I think that's, certainly economic. And I think it's a combination of, just the way that the news cycle perpetuates the very legitimate and awful things that are happening in the world, right? That like need attention. And I think if you only look at sort of the scale of that, like it is really easy to get stuck in that pessimism and have that not lead you to action. And I think the refocusing point for me is, and the thing that drives my optimism, and I am very much a glass half full kind of person, is how absolutely inclusive and welcoming like the ocean tech and the climate tech spaces are, and sort of the recognition that like we all have to do something, and that it is incredibly accessible, that you can just email, anyone or ping someone for an intro into someone into, an echelon that you might not otherwise think you could get into, and have a conversation with someone to really understand what's happening. And I think this, again, the surprised we made it to this point of the recording without a boat pun, but here we go. It's definitely an area where, rising tide lifts all ships. And we believe that all working together, thank you, that we work, working all together can improve it. And I think as I look at, future generations of talent and collaborators and customers and colleagues and co-conspirators and things, like there are so many individuals and organizations that are looking at the oceans and various aspects of the ocean, like we talked about, fishers to nonprofits to transportation organizations to, other energy, offshore wind. So like there's so many areas where this overlaps, where like you almost have to temper your enthusiasm and optimism because it almost like gets to be too much. So I would say, as a glass half full person, I'm incredibly optimistic. And I would say that where I think the pessimism is warranted is, I don't think we should let our optimism sort of get in the way of acknowledging that there are some really big, meaty things that sit both within our industry and outside of our industry that require a consistent set of leadership from both, elected officials and, larger business organizations and leaders to get ahead of what's happening. And I say that both in the context of 2024 political elections here, upcoming elections in Canada, as well as just sort of the global conflict. Like, don't let that enthusiasm get in the way of the need for action elsewhere. But also, if you focus on what you need to do day in and day out, there's a lot to be excited about.
I totally agree about the collaborative, well, all of that, but especially that's like collaborative and open nature of the climate tech community. I've found that too. And I really hope that as the community grows and matures, we can keep that same kind of mentality, because it's so awesome. Yeah, thanks for calling that out. Who is another company or individual doing something to address climate change that's inspiring you?
Yeah, Tom Loeffler over at Holbot. He's a CEO of an Australian-based company, Holbot. I've actually be a great potential guest on your podcast. He's building a tethered, autonomous hull cleaning robot that cleans the underside of hulls. And the intent of it is that if you have algae and crustaceans and the mollusks growing on your hull, well, you reduce the efficiency of your hull. And for those hulls that we haven't yet electrified, well, that's increased fuel that you're using. Or if it's a racing sailboat, then your sailboat's not going as fast. And so Hullbot has built this novel IP, around using OpenCV and these little robots that just kind of like something like out of the Matrix, like go underneath your boat and just kind of like scrub and clean. So yeah, he's inspired. He's got a very specific problem that he's solving, and he knows how to talk about it and demonstrate it. And it's a cool looking thing. Like, who doesn't want like a robot cleaning the other side of your hull?
All right. I would love to talk to Tom about his robot. That sounds great. What advice do you have for someone not working in climate today who wants to do something to help?
I'd give two pieces of advice to someone in the space. I think the first thing is, if you're not working in climate today, you will absolutely be working in climate tomorrow, whether you choose to work in climate or not, because I do fundamentally believe that every job will be a climate job within the next 5 years. It might not be labeled as such in the same way that you using email isn't labeled, digital versus not digital, but every job will have a climate aspect to it. We will need to understand the sourcing of our components, of our parts, of our systems, of our supply chain with regards to the climate. We will make decisions around where we open offices or don't open offices based on climate resiliency and climate refugees and the geopolitical conflicts that are yet to come because of just pure climate decisions. We will make investment in particular areas or insurance policies based on climate resiliency, and the reinsurance market, for coral reefs, in particular areas like might go through the roof. So I offer that every job will be a climate job. For someone who says, hey, I actually want to jump into climate specifically, and I want the company to actually acknowledge that the work is climate related, I would say that there's any number of groups either on, Slack or in your community that are driving climate consideration. If you're in Portland, the one that's been really helpful for me is a group called Climate Curious that just started with like a weekly meetup. And it was a spin out of another group, MCJ's, sort of climate work on climate sort of effort. And so find the Slack group that has the weekly meetup in your town and just go hang out. And I would say that, most of the people that I've met over the years of going to their events started out with, oh, I'm at, this big company and I'm thinking about climate. And now they're welcoming other people because they've joined a climate company or they've invested in a climate company or they're advising. So you don't have to quit your day job and jump into climate today. You might at some point, but you can certainly start building out that network and realize that, whether you see yourself immediately parlaying your skills into climate or not, there's a lot of insight and advice that you might have that could be beneficial to a climate tech startup today, or climate tech founder today, or just a climate tech, or just a climate individual. I would say not everything is technology driven. There's certainly nonprofits and other business organizations and municipalities that are looking at climate in novel ways that you're like, oh, yeah, I can do this, and kind of encourage you to either advise or maybe jump ship and transition into that place. So start with your local community, and if you don't have, a chapter of a thing, don't be afraid to start a thing and ask, within those Slack channels. And if not, a lot of those resources in those communities are also completely online and not tied to geography. So jump into those Slack or Discord groups and just start lurking and start asking some questions once you've built up enough confidence.
Yeah, I love it. And thanks for calling out Climate Curious. I love what those guys are doing. And I should shout out to Jordan Rice, who started Climate Curious and also connected the two of us. They're doing awesome stuff. Sweet. Marcelino, thank you for your time. That was awesome. Really fun to learn more about what you're doing. I'm excited to see where things go. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's get you out on the water. And if any of your listeners are ever out in Portland and want to go out for a sea trial, please have them reach out.
I would love that. Awesome. Thanks. Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. To find out more about us and how we develop hardware solutions for the world's most ambitious companies, head to synapse.com. And then make sure to search for Hardware to Save a Planet in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere you like to listen. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Synapse, thanks for listening.